Have you ever been judged by your job, your clothes, or the money in your pocket? We've all felt that sting of being underestimated, of being dismissed before we even have a chance to speak. But what happens when that judgment comes from a man who can buy the entire city block you live on? What happens when a simple waitress struggling to survive is publicly humiliated by a ruthless billionaire in a room full of the world's elite? You might think you know how this story ends, with tears and a quiet retreat. But you'd be wrong. This is the story of Ilara Vance, a woman with nothing left to lose, and the night she didn't just talk back, she changed everything. The starched white apron felt heavier than usual on Ilara Vance's hips. It was a physical manifestation of the invisible weight she carried every single day. The weight of unpaid medical bills, the crushing rent for her tiny, drafty apartment, and the suffocating memory of a life that felt like a half-remembered dream. Her world was now confined to the 100-square-foot patch of polished mahogany floor at Aria downtown Manhattan's most exclusive dining establishment. Aria wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theater. The patrons were the stars adorned in designer clothes and million-dollar watches, and the staff were the silent, efficient stagehands trained to be invisible until needed. Ilara had mastered the art of invisibility. She could glide between tables laden with crystal glasses and plates of food that cost more than her weekly salary, her face a perfect mask of pleasant neutrality. Tonight, the air in Aria was electric thick with the scent of white truffle and quiet ambition. A major deal was being brokered in the private dining room, the Verona suite. Ilara's manager, a perpetually stressed man named Mr. Dubois, had pulled her aside earlier. "Vance," he'd said, his voice a low hiss. "Table 7, the Sterling party. This is not the night for mistakes. The man is Alexander Sterling. You know who he is?" Ilara knew. Everyone knew. Alexander Sterling was a titan of the tech industry, a man whose picture was plastered on business magazines with headlines like "The Vulture of Silicon Valley" and "The Billionaire Who Buys and Buries." He was infamous for his brutal business tactics and his even more brutal personality. He was new money, a shark who had devoured his way to the top, and now circled looking for his next meal. For Ilara, he was just another customer. A difficult one to be sure, but her job was to serve, smile, and survive the shift. Survival was her primary focus. After her shift, she would take the rattling subway train back to Queens to the small apartment she shared with her mother, Catherine. Catherine, a woman who once debated Renaissance poetry at university cocktail parties, now spent most of her days in a worn armchair. Her world shrunk by a chronic illness that the doctors called a progressive neurological decline. It was a vague, terrifying diagnosis that required expensive specialists and medications that Ilara's meager tips could barely cover. As she refilled a water glass for a woman draped in diamonds, Ilara's mind drifted back. She remembered a different life, a life of warmth and light. She remembered her father, Professor Alistair Vance. He wasn't a billionaire, but he was rich in a way Alexander Sterling could never comprehend. He was a celebrated art historian and a leading expert in classical languages, a man whose home was filled not with stock certificates, but with books that smelled of aging paper and leather. He had been the one to teach her the music of other tongues. They didn't just study vocabulary. They inhaled the culture. He would read her ancient poems as bedtime stories, his voice rising and falling with the cadence of forgotten empires. Their summers were spent in Italy, not in five-star resorts, but in dusty libraries in Florence, and walking through sun-drenched ruins in Rome. He had given her a gift, a key to a world of beauty and history. Then that world had shattered. Professor Vance, the most honorable man Elara had ever known, was accused of authenticating a forged Renaissance sculpture. The scandal was a media firestorm. He was disgraced, his reputation destroyed, his career turned to ash. The university cut ties, friends disappeared, and the legal fees devoured their life savings. The stress broke him. A heart attack, swift and merciless, took him from her a year later. They lost everything: the house, the books, the life they knew. Elara, who had been on the cusp of starting her own PhD program in art history, was forced to drop out and find work. Any work. Now her deep knowledge of 15th century Florentine art was only useful for ensuring the silverware was aligned with mathematical precision. Her fluency in languages was reduced to reciting the daily specials. A sharp snap of fingers pulled her from her reverie. A man at table 4 was glaring at her, his empty bread plate a silent accusation. "Sorry, sir," she murmured, her face flushing as she hurried to retrieve the basket. She was losing her focus. Mr. Dubois's warning echoed in her ears. Not tonight. She took a deep breath, pushing the memories down, locking them away in the vault where she kept her grief. She was not Elara Vance, daughter of a brilliant professor. She was Waitress 12. And Table 7, the Sterling party, was about to arrive. She smoothed her apron, the heavy fabric, a reminder of her reality, and prepared for the storm. The front doors of Aria opened with a whisper, and a palpable shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. The low hum of conversation faltered. Heads turned. It was as if a predator had just entered the watering hole. Alexander Sterling did not walk. He commanded the space around him. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a custom charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elara's car if she'd had one. His hair was dark and perfectly styled, but it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were the color of cold steel, sharp and analytical, constantly assessing, valuing, and dismissing everything they landed on. They swept across the dining room with a look of profound boredom, as if the sheer opulence of the place was an amusing but ultimately trivial display. Flanking him were 2 men in equally expensive but less imposing suits. His lawyers or advisors, their expressions a mixture of deference and anxiety. Clinging to his arm was a woman whose name Elara vaguely recalled from gossip columns, Tiffany Moore, a model or influencer of some kind. She was stunningly beautiful in a tight crimson dress, her smile bright and brittle. But Elara's attention was drawn to the 2 other men in their party who followed a step behind Sterling. They were older, in their late 60s, with weathered faces and an air of quiet, unshakable dignity. They were dressed in exquisitely tailored but more conservative attire. Unlike Sterling, who radiated a restless, aggressive energy, these 2 men moved with a deliberate calm. They observed the restaurant not with boredom, but with genuine appreciation. Elara recognized the look of old-world Europeans, men accustomed to quality, but not defined by ostentation. These, she deduced, were the reasons for this high-stakes dinner. Mr. Dubois practically materialized at the front, his posture a deep bow without actually bowing. "Mr. Sterling, welcome to Aria. Your table is ready. The Verona suite." Sterling didn't acknowledge him. He was already striding towards the private room, his entourage scrambling to keep up. As they passed Elara's station, his cold eyes grazed over her for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a look of recognition or even dismissal. It was a look of utter non-existence. To him, she was part of the furniture, a functional object in a starched apron. Tiffany, however, gave her a head-to-toe scan, a faint, condescending smirk playing on her lips, as if to say, "Look at you. And look at me." Elara felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach, but she kept her expression serene, her spine straight. She had served arrogant men and their beautiful companions before. It was part of the job description. "Vance," Mr. Dubois hissed, scurrying back from the private room. "You have table 7. Go, now. Remember the protocol. Do not speak unless spoken to. Anticipate, don't ask. And for the love of God, do not spill anything." She nodded, picking up her silver tray with menus and a chilled bottle of sparkling water. Her heart beat a little faster as she approached the heavy oak door of the Verona suite. She could hear Sterling's booming voice from inside, already talking business. She pushed the door open and entered. The room was magnificent, with a single long table set for 6, a private fireplace, and a large window overlooking the twinkling city skyline. The mood, however, was tense. Sterling was at the head of the table holding court. Tiffany sat adoringly at his side, while the lawyers looked on nervously. The 2 Italian gentlemen who Sterling had briefly introduced as Lorenzo and Matteo sat opposite them, their expressions polite but reserved. Elara moved with practiced silence, placing menus before each guest. When she reached Sterling, he waved a dismissive hand without looking up from his phone. "I already know what I want. Steak, rare, and a bottle of your most expensive red wine, the 1982 Cheval Blanc." "A very good choice, sir," Elara said softly. He finally looked up, his steel-grey eyes narrowing slightly as if surprised a piece of furniture had spoken. "Just bring it." She then turned to the Italian guests. "And for you, gentlemen." The older of the 2, Lorenzo, offered her a small, courteous smile. It was the first genuine smile she had received all night, and it caught her off guard. He picked up the menu, a thick, leather-bound volume. His brow furrowed slightly as he opened it. Aria prided itself on authenticity. The menu, especially for the private suites, was presented traditionally with dishes listed under their proper Italian headers and described using their regional names and culinary terms, with only brief English subtitles underneath. Lorenzo looked at his companion Matteo, and they exchanged a few words in their native tongue. It was a soft, melodic exchange, a stark contrast to Sterling's harsh, transactional English. Elara felt a pang of nostalgia, the sound of the language, a phantom limb from her past life. Sterling looked up, his impatience growing. "Problem, gentlemen, just get the lobster. It's what everyone gets." Lorenzo cleared his throat, his English accented, but precise. "It is no problem, Mr. Sterling. It is just... This menu is very traditional, very specific. We wish to understand the chef's regional specialties." "Right," Sterling grunted, turning his impatient glare on Elara. "Well, tell them what's good. The fish, the steak, whatever. Let's get this over with." Elara opened her mouth to recite the chef's recommendations, the pre-approved, simplified script for indecisive diners. But before she could speak, Tiffany let out a little laugh, a sound like tiny shards of glass. "Alex, darling, be reasonable," she purred, looking at Elara with pitying amusement. "What is she going to know about it? It's all in a foreign language. She probably just learned to say catch of the day this morning." The jab landed with surgical precision. The lawyers snickered. Sterling's lips curved into a cruel smirk. The air grew thick with humiliation. Elara stood frozen, the heavy menu in Lorenzo's hands suddenly feeling like a stone tablet engraved with her own inadequacy. The weight of her apron had never felt so crushing. The silence in the Verona suite stretched into a taut, uncomfortable wire. Lorenzo and Matteo exchanged another look, this one laced with a clear sense of discomfort. They were men of honor and tradition, and the casual cruelty directed at a service worker was clearly not to their taste. But they were guests, and this was Alexander Sterling's show. Sterling, however, seemed to feed on the awkwardness. He saw the world as a simple hierarchy, the powerful and the serving. In his mind, he was simply reinforcing the natural order of things. "She's right," he said, leaning back in his chair with an air of theatrical authority. He gestured vaguely at the menu in Lorenzo's hands. "It's a business expense. Just point at something. I'm sure it's all overpriced." Lorenzo, ever the diplomat, attempted to smooth things over. He addressed Elara directly, his tone gentle, as if trying to shield her from the hostility of his host. "Young lady, perhaps you could tell us about this dish here," he said, pointing to a line on the menu. "The description is brief." Elara's eyes flicked to the words. Lamb, burnt fingers. A classic Roman dish. She could almost taste the smoky char of the grill, almost smell the rosemary. And garlic. She could picture the bustling trattorias near the Pantheon, where her father had first ordered it for her, explaining how the name came from the tradition of eating the sizzling hot chops with your hands burning your fingers. A torrent of words, explanations and memories bubbled up inside her, but the protocol was clear. Be brief. Be simple. "That is the grilled lamb chops, sir," she said, her voice quiet and even. "It is a house specialty." Sterling scoffed loudly. "The grilled lamb chops. See, a complete waste of time. It's lamb. You cook it with fire. What more is there to say?" He turned his full attention to Lorenzo, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial man-to-man tone. "Look, let's cut the nonsense. We're here to talk about the future of the Rossi d'Antonio vineyard, not to decipher a cookbook. Let's order something simple so we can get down to business." Matteo, the quieter of the two brothers, spoke up for the first time. His voice was deeper than his brother's, with a gravelly edge. "Mr. Sterling, with respect for us, food is not nonsense. It is culture. The way a chef from a particular region prepares a dish tells a story about the land, about the people, about history. This menu, it is a map of Italy. We only wish to find our home on it." His eloquent defense of his culture seemed to fly right over Sterling's head. To the tech billionaire, it was just more flowery, inefficient time-wasting. He saw it as a deliberate obstacle, a refusal to get to the point, the numbers, the contracts, the acquisition. His patience, already razor-thin, finally snapped. He slammed his hand flat on the table. The crystal water glasses jumped. Tiffany flinched. The lawyers sat up straighter like frightened meerkats. "Forget it!" Sterling boomed his voice, filling the room. He glared at Elara, his eyes blazing with contempt. He didn't see a person. He saw the focal point of his frustration, the symbol of the inefficiency that was holding up his deal. "How is she supposed to help us?" he bellowed, gesturing at her with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He looked directly at Lorenzo and Matteo, as if she weren't even there. "We're sitting here trying to have a serious discussion, and we're being held up by a menu. A menu this girl probably uses as a placemat." He paused for effect, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face as he delivered the final crushing blow. "Honestly, what's the point in asking her? She can't even read the menu." The words hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. It was more than an insult. It was a verdict, a declaration of her worthlessness. In that one sentence, he had stripped her of her intelligence, her history, her humanity. He had reduced her entire existence to the starched white apron she wore. Tiffany let out another tinkling, cruel laugh. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Elara's gaze. Elara stood perfectly still. For a moment she felt nothing but a dull, ringing silence in her ears. The room seemed to fade at the edges. All she could see was Sterling's smug, victorious face. The face of a man who had never known hardship, never known loss, never known what it felt like to be invisible. And then something inside her broke. It wasn't a loud, violent snap, but a quiet, seismic shift. It was the part of her that had endured the whispers after her father's downfall. The part that had swallowed her pride and taken this job. The part that cleaned up after the wealthy and powerful every night, while her brilliant mother wasted away. The part of her that had stayed silent for far, far too long. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a quote from Dante he loved to repeat. "Do not be afraid. Our fate cannot be taken from us. It is a gift." Her fate was not to stand here and be humiliated. Her gift was not something to be hidden away in shame. She lifted her chin. Her eyes, which had been downcast and deferential, met Alexander Sterling's gaze directly. The pleasant, neutral mask fell away, revealing a flicker of fire that had been dormant for years. She took a slow, deliberate breath, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath with her. The silence was a vacuum, and Alara was about to fill it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't resort to insults. Instead, she spoke with a calm, crystalline clarity that cut through the tension like a diamond on glass. She turned her body slightly, directing her words not to the sneering billionaire, but to the two men who had shown her a sliver of courtesy. She looked directly at Lorenzo and Matteo Rossi. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and resonant, imbued with an authority that stunned the table into silence. "You are from Tuscany, are you not? Near Florence, perhaps?" The Rossi brothers looked at each other, their eyebrows raised in surprise. Lorenzo nodded slowly. "Yes. How did you know?" "From the way you speak," Alara replied, a faint, sad smile gracing her lips. "Your dialect has the cadence of the Arno River. It's a sound my father cherished." Alexander Sterling let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Oh, here we go. The waitress is a poet." Alara ignored him completely, her focus entirely on the two Italians. She gestured towards the menu in Lorenzo's hand. "Mr. Sterling is correct about one thing," she said, her voice taking on a new, richer tone. "This is not just a cookbook. It is, as you said, a map. And it is a map I know by heart." She began to speak, and it was as if a different person had taken over her body. The timid, subservient waitress was gone, replaced by a confident, passionate scholar. "The lamb chops you asked about," she started, her eyes alight with memory, "are from Rome. They're brash, simple, and powerful like the city itself. But if you are looking for a taste of home, you must look further down under the main courses. Do you see the Florentine steak?" She didn't wait for an answer. "The chef here, to his credit, prepares it in the true fashion. It's not just a steak. It is a Chianina heifer, aged for precisely 30 days. It is never cooked more than rare, seasoned only with salt, pepper, and the finest local olive oil after it leaves the grill. To cook it any other way is an insult to the generations of butchers in the Mercato Centrale who perfected the cut." Her voice was a melody. She described the food with such vividness that the air seemed to fill with the aromas of wood smoke and roasting meat. The Rossi brothers were leaning forward now, utterly captivated. "And for your first course," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the page, "you might ignore the more common pastas. Look here," she said, pointing to a specific item. A wide, flat pasta with a wild boar sauce. This isn't a delicate dish. It's a taste of the forest floor of autumn in the Chianti Hills. It speaks of the hunt of long, slow simmering of a recipe passed down from a grandmother who never wrote anything down. It is a dish of patience and heritage. She moved seamlessly from one region to another. Her knowledge encyclopedic, her passion infectious. She explained the subtle differences between a Sicilian caponata and its northern cousins, the historical significance of a salt-cured cod dish from Venice, the peasant origins of a hearty polenta from the Alpine foothills. She wasn't just translating words, she was translating culture, history, and soul. The wine Mr. Sterling selected, the Cheval Blanc, is an exceptional Bordeaux, she said with professional deference. But it would be a crime to pair it with the Florentine steak. It would overpower the simplicity of the meat. You need something with body, but also with Tuscan earthiness, from a small family-run estate. It would not be the most expensive on the list, but it would be the right one. The entire time she spoke, she never once used a foreign word. She didn't need to. She painted a picture with her English prose so vibrant that the Rossi brothers could hear the music of their own language in her descriptions. Finally, she stopped. The Verona suite was utterly silent, save for the crackling of the fire. The two lawyers stared at her, their mouths slightly agape. Tiffany Moore's painted-on smile had vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. And Alexander Sterling. He was speechless. His face was a mask of pure shock. The smug superiority had been wiped away, leaving behind a raw, naked bewilderment. He had built an empire on data, on algorithms, on predicting outcomes. But he could never have predicted this. He had tried to crush a fly, and a dragon had answered. It was Lorenzo Rossi who broke the spell. He slowly placed his menu down on the table. He looked at Elara, and his eyes were shining with a profound respect. Incredible, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Then he looked at his brother, and a wide, genuine smile spread across his face. He turned back to Elara. "Young lady," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have given us a tour of our own country, better than any guide in Florence. Please," he said, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Sit. Join us. Tell us more." The request was a cannonball fired through the rigid etiquette of Aria. A waitress, sitting with the guests. It was unthinkable. Mr. Dubois would have a heart attack. But before Elara could politely refuse, Alexander Sterling found his voice. It was a choked, strangled sound. "What did you say your name was?" he asked, his steel-grey eyes fixed on her. No longer with contempt, but with a dawning, terrifying sense of having made a catastrophic mistake. "My name," she said, her voice clear and proud, "is Elara Vance." The name hung in the air. Elara Vance. To Alexander Sterling and his entourage, it meant nothing. It was just a name. But to Lorenzo Rossi, it was a key unlocking a dusty room in his memory. His expression changed, the look of pleasant surprise, deepening into one of keen, almost urgent interest. "Vance," he repeated, his brow furrowed in concentration. He leaned forward, studying Elara's face, searching for a ghost in her features. "That is not a common name. Forgive me, but did you by any chance know Professor Alistair Vance?" The mention of her father's full name was like a physical blow. Elara's composure, so brilliantly held for the past 10 minutes, finally wavered. A wave of grief and love washed over her. Her eyes misted over. "He was my father," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A heavy silence descended upon the table. Matteo Rossi put his hand on his brother's arm, a look of sad understanding passing between them. Lorenzo's face was a portrait of sorrow. "My dear child," he said, his voice gentle and full of regret. "I am so sorry. Your father, he was a great man, a brilliant man. I had the honor of meeting him twice at academic conferences in Rome. He had a passion for our culture that was second to none. What happened to him, the scandal, it was a travesty, a great injustice." Every word was a vindication, a balm on a wound Elara thought would never heal. To hear someone, a respected stranger, speak of her father with such reverence and defend his honor, it was more than she could have ever hoped for. Tears she had refused to shed for years now threatened to fall. Sterling watched this exchange, his mind racing. The dinner, his multi-billion-dollar acquisition, was careening off the rails. The waitress he had so brutally insulted was not just some random girl. She was the daughter of a man his potential partners deeply admired. He had not just been rude. He had been sacrilegious. He had stomped his feet on holy ground without even knowing it. "Sit," Lorenzo insisted again, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked pointedly at Sterling. "She will dine with us." It was a command, not a request. Sterling, for the first time in perhaps a decade, was not in control. He was a guest at his own table. To refuse would be to torpedo the deal instantly. He gritted his teeth and gave a curt, jerky nod. Elara hesitated, glancing towards the door, expecting Mr. Dubois to burst in and fire her on the spot. But the opportunity to speak of her father, to honor his memory in this room, was too powerful to resist. Slowly she untied the strings of her apron, folded the heavy, weighted fabric, and placed it on her empty serving tray. It was a symbolic act of liberation. Then she walked with quiet dignity and took the empty seat between Lorenzo and Matteo. One of Sterling's lawyers, seeing the shift in power quickly and awkwardly, stood up to pull the chair out for her. The gesture was so out of place, so contrary to the events of the past hour, that it bordered on the absurd. For the next hour, the conversation had nothing to do with vineyards or distribution rights. It was all about Professor Alistair Vance. Prompted by Lorenzo's gentle questions, Elara spoke about her father. She told them about his love for obscure Renaissance poets, his uncanny ability to spot a forgery from a dozen paces, and the summer they spent meticulously translating ancient Latin texts, just for the joy of it. She spoke of his final year of his heartbreak, and his unwavering insistence on his own innocence. As she talked, the Rossi brothers listened with rapt attention, nodding, sighing, and sharing their own memories of the professor's brilliant lectures. Sterling and his side of the table remained silent. Tiffany looked bored and confused, scrolling surreptitiously on her phone beneath the table. The lawyers stared at their plates, but Sterling was listening. Every word. He was a man who processed information, who looked for patterns and leverage, and amidst the emotional storytelling, he was beginning to see the pieces of a puzzle he didn't know existed. "The man who accused him," Matteo said, his voice rumbling with anger. "The collector who produced the forged sculpture and claimed your father authenticated it for a bribe. What was his name? Marcus Thorne." Elara said the name, tasting like poison on her tongue. "He was a rival collector, always jealous of my father's reputation. He built his case on a series of fabricated emails and a forged signature. We had no money to hire the right experts to fight him. By the time it was over, my father's name was ruined." At the name Marcus Thorne, Alexander Sterling's head snapped up. His cold, calculating eyes narrowed. The puzzle pieces were no longer just on the table. They were flying together, locking into place with terrifying speed. Marcus Thorne was not just a name to him. He was a vicious competitor in the art and antiquities market, a world Sterling had recently entered through his venture capital firm. Thorne had outbid him on 2 major acquisitions in the last year, using what Sterling suspected were underhanded tactics. Thorne was a snake, and Sterling had been looking for a reason to crush him. Suddenly, this dinner wasn't just about acquiring a vineyard. It was about something more, an opportunity. A weapon had just fallen into his lap. Lorenzo Rossi, seemingly unaware of the silent calculations happening across the table, reached over and patted Ilara's hand. "Your father's honor must be restored," he said with firm conviction. He then turned his gaze, as sharp and penetrating as a hawk's, directly onto Alexander Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," Lorenzo said, his voice devoid of its earlier warmth, now cool and direct. "We came here tonight to discuss a partnership. We Rossi brothers believe that business is not just about profit. It is about character, about honor. We would be hesitant to partner with any man who would allow such an injustice brought to his own table to stand." The implication was crystal clear. It was a condition, an ultimatum. The deal for the Rossi Antonio vineyard was now inextricably linked to the honor of a dead professor and the fate of a waitress he had tried to destroy. Alexander Sterling was trapped, and for the first time he realized that the most valuable asset in the room wasn't his bank account, but the quiet, grieving woman sitting opposite him. The shift in the room was seismic. Alexander Sterling was no longer a king holding court. He was a defendant in the dock, and the Rossi brothers were his judges. His multi-billion-dollar play for their historic vineyard, a cornerstone of his plan to diversify his empire into legacy luxury brands, was now hanging by a thread. And that thread was held by Ilara Vance. He analyzed the situation with the cold, detached logic he usually applied to hostile takeovers. Problem: the Rossi brothers value honor above all else. They see the plight of Ilara Vance as a direct test of his character. Obstacle: Marcus Thorne, a man who not only ruined Ilara's father, but is also Sterling's business rival. Opportunity: destroying Thorne would serve 2 purposes. It would satisfy the Rossi brothers' condition, securing the deal, and it would eliminate a competitor he already despised. Solution: he had to help Ilara. It wasn't a matter of morality or compassion. For Sterling, it was a strategic imperative, a move on a chessboard so complex that only he could see all the angles. He leaned forward, his polished facade of the charming host replaced by the raw, focused intensity of the predator he truly was. "Mr. Rossi," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. What happened to Professor Vance was more than an injustice. It was a criminal act. And Marcus Thorne is more than just a dishonorable man. He is a cancer in the world of art and business. He looked directly at Ilara, his steel-grey eyes locking with hers. The contempt was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling calculation. "Miss Vance, you said you couldn't afford the right experts. That is no longer the case. I have on retainer the most ruthless, effective, and expensive team of forensic investigators and legal minds on the planet. They can uncover a forged email from a decade ago as easily as I can check my stock portfolio." He let that sink in. He was offering her the full, terrifying power of his wealth and influence. He was offering her a private army to wage the war her family had lost. "I will put my entire team at your disposal," he declared. "We will not just clear your father's name. We will dismantle Marcus Thorne's reputation, his business, and his life, piece by piece. We will find the proof, we will expose him, and we will see him ruined. The offer was breathtaking in its scope and its viciousness. Elara felt a dizzying mix of hope and revulsion. This man who had humiliated her 30 minutes ago was now offering her the one thing she wanted most in the world, justice for her father. But it was a justice delivered with the cold fury of a corporate raider, not the passion of a righteous crusader. It was a devil's bargain. Lorenzo and Matteo watched him, their faces unreadable. They had presented the test, and Sterling was answering with overwhelming, brutal force. "Why would you do this?" Elara asked, her voice quiet but firm. She was no fool. She knew this wasn't about her. Sterling gave her a look that was almost a sign of respect. He appreciated that she hadn't dissolved into grateful tears. She was questioning his motives just as he would. "Let's be transparent," he said, a corner of his mouth turning up in a wry, humorless smile. "Marcus Thorne is an obstacle to my business interests, a particularly irritating one. Ruining him is something I would consider a worthwhile expenditure, regardless of the circumstances. The fact that it aligns with achieving justice for your father, and in turn satisfies the character assessment of my potential business partners," he glanced at the Rossi brothers, "makes it an exceptionally efficient investment." There it was, cold, honest, and utterly devoid of sentiment. He wasn't her savior. She was his tool, his key to both a business deal and revenge. Elara looked from Sterling's predatory gaze to the solemn faces of the Rossi brothers. They had given her this opening. They had used their own power to give her a voice. And now this terrible, magnificent weapon was being laid at her feet. Could she wield it, even if it was offered by a monster? For her father's memory. For her mother, who deserved to live her final years with their family name cleared of its stain. She thought of her father, a man of books and quiet integrity. He would have abhorred Alexander Sterling's methods, but he also would have fought to his last breath for the truth. This was her fight now, and she couldn't win it with academic theories and quiet dignity. She needed a battering ram, and Sterling was offering her one. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice finding its strength again. A wolfish grin spread across Sterling's face. The deal was back on track. "Everything," he said. "Every letter, every old file, every memory you have of the case. My people will be in touch tomorrow morning." He snapped his fingers, and one of his lawyers, startled, immediately pulled out a phone. "Get Mark Calloway on the line. Tell him to clear his schedule. All of it." Calloway was his lead investigator, a man known for finding skeletons in the most heavily guarded closets. The rest of the dinner was a surreal affair. The magnificent food that Elara had so beautifully described was brought out course after course. But now the atmosphere was not of a meal, but a war council. Elara Sterling and the Rossi brothers discussed the strategy, the old evidence, the players involved in the original scandal. Tiffany sat in bewildered silence, completely out of her depth, a decorative accessory in a room now filled with purpose. By the time the espresso was served, a plan was in motion. Sterling, with his terrifying efficiency, had already outlined the first 3 steps of the investigation. The Rossi brothers had made it clear that their final decision on the vineyard partnership would be made upon the successful conclusion of this matter of honor. As the dinner ended, Sterling stood. He looked at Elara, who remained seated, no longer his waitress, but a strange, temporary partner. "My car will take you home, Miss Vance," he stated. It wasn't an offer. "Thank you, but I can take the subway," she replied, a small act of defiance, a reminder to him and to herself that she was not yet one of his possessions. Lorenzo Rossi smiled warmly. "Nonsense, my child. Allow us." He and Matteo insisted on escorting her, a gesture of protection and respect. As Elara walked out of the Verona suite, flanked by the two distinguished Italian gentlemen, she paused and looked back. Alexander Sterling was watching her, his phone to his ear, his eyes alight with the thrill of the hunt. He had come to Aria tonight to conquer a company. He had left with a far more complicated prize, a cause, a rival to destroy, and an unlikely alliance with the woman he had tried to break. The game had changed, and the stakes were now higher than he could ever have imagined. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Elara's life was cleaved in two. By night, she still wore the heavy apron at Aria, serving entitled patrons and enduring Mr. Dubois' nervous scrutiny. He knew something had happened in the Verona suite, something that had shifted the balance of power, and it made him treat her with a strange, fearful respect. But by day, her tiny queen's apartment became the war room for the reclamation of the Vance family name. Alexander Sterling was true to his word. His team descended with the force of a military operation. Mark Calloway, the chief investigator, was a former federal prosecutor with eyes that missed nothing. He and his team of forensic accountants, computer experts, and private detectives treated Elara not as a waitress, but as their primary source. They listened to her for hours, digitizing her father's old journals, re-examining every piece of evidence from the original case. Sterling himself was a constant disembodied presence. He never came to the apartment. Instead, he communicated through encrypted messages and curt phone calls demanding updates, issuing orders, and pushing the investigation forward with relentless momentum. For him, this was a campaign, and he was its general. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later. Sterling's forensic team, using technology that hadn't existed when her father was accused, found microscopic inconsistencies in the digital architecture of the damning emails fragments of code that proved they had been created and backdated on a different server before being ordered to look like they came from Professor Vance's account. It was the digital smoking gun. Simultaneously, Calloway's investigators, using Sterling's vast financial leverage to persuade people to talk, found the art dealer who had originally brokered the deal for the forged sculpture. Faced with the threat of financial ruin and legal exposure orchestrated by Sterling's lawyers, the dealer confessed. He admitted that Marcus Thorne had paid him handsomely to lie and corroborate the fabricated story. He had the offshore bank records to prove it. The case they built was airtight, brutal, and undeniable. Sterling didn't leak the story to a single newspaper. Instead, he arranged a private meeting. He convened it at a neutral location, a private boardroom at a prestigious law firm. In attendance were Marcus Thorne, his lawyers, Elara the Rossi brothers, and a board member from the museum that now held the forged sculpture. Thorne arrived looking confident, arrogant, ready to dismiss the meeting as a nuisance. But his color drained as Mark Calloway, with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon, laid out the evidence, the forensic data, the sworn affidavit from the dealer, the banking records. It was an avalanche that buried Thorne completely. By the end of the presentation, Thorne was ashen. Sterling leaned back, a picture of calm, predatory satisfaction. He didn't say a word. He let the silence and the weight of the evidence crush his rival. The resolution was swift and merciless. To avoid public prosecution that would have utterly destroyed him, Thorne agreed to Sterling's terms. He would issue a full public confession and apology clearing Alistair Vance's name completely. He would donate a massive multi-million-dollar sum to a new academic foundation established in Professor Vance's name. and he would sell his entire collection of antiquities, the one Sterling had been competing for, to Sterling's holding company for a fraction of its market value. It was total capitulation. A week later, the story broke, not as a scandal, but as a vindication. The headlines read, "Renowned art historian Alistair Vance posthumously exonerated, and collector Marcus Thorne admits to fraud." For Ilara, it was like breathing again after years of being held under water. She sat with her mother Catherine reading the articles aloud. For the first time in years, a light of clarity and peace returned to her mother's eyes. The weight of shame she hadn't even realized she was carrying had lifted. The name Vance was once again a source of pride. The day after the news broke, a long black car pulled up outside her apartment building. A driver in a black suit held the door open. Ilara knew who it was from. She met Alexander Sterling on the rooftop terrace of his sky-high penthouse, the city sprawling beneath them like a map of his kingdom. "The Rossi brothers signed the final papers this morning," he said, handing her a glass of champagne. "The vineyard is mine." "Congratulations," Ilara said, her voice neutral. "They have also endowed the Alistair Vance Foundation with a founding gift of $5 million, he added. "It seems your father's name carries significant weight." He looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "The foundation needs a director, someone who understands the subject matter, the legacy. Someone who speaks the language, literally and figuratively. The board, which now includes myself and Lorenzo Rossi, has voted unanimously. The position is yours should you want it." He was offering her a new life, a return to the world she had lost, but this time on her own terms. She would be the guardian of her father's legacy, a position of power and respect. She wouldn't be working for Sterling, but with him on the board of an independent foundation. "Why?" She asked the same question she'd asked at the dinner. "You have what you wanted." Sterling swirled the champagne in his glass, looking out at the skyline. "I deal in assets," he said, his voice quiet. "I buy companies' technology real estate. That night at Aria, I witnessed an asset I couldn't quantify. Your knowledge, your passion. It wasn't just about the menu. It was about a depth of understanding I have never encountered. It has value. My businesses are expanding into Europe, into luxury markets built on centuries of culture I don't understand. I am a shark, Miss Vance. But even a shark can see the value in a master navigator." It was the closest he would ever come to an apology, to an admission of respect. Ilara thought for a moment. She thought of the starched apron, the condescending sneers, the crushing weight of her old life. And she thought of her father, of his honor. This was the ultimate tribute to him. She could continue his work. She met Sterling's gaze, her own eyes clear and strong. "I accept, Mr. Sterling, but my first act as director will be to table a motion to acquire a particular Renaissance manuscript at auction next month. It will be very expensive." A slow smile spread across Alexander Sterling's face. It was the first genuine smile she had ever seen on him. "I look forward to the debate, Director Vance." He had come for a vineyard, but he had acquired something far rarer. And Ilara, the poor waitress who couldn't even read the menu, had not only reclaimed her family's name, but had also found her own. Ilara's story reminds us that our true worth isn't determined by our job title, our uniform, or the balance in our bank account. It lies in our knowledge, our integrity, and the fire we carry inside us from the people we've loved and the lives we've lived. She walked into that room as a waitress, but left as a leader, proving that dignity and intelligence are currencies that even billionaires are forced to respect. She didn't just win an argument, she reclaimed a legacy. What did you think of Ilara's incredible journey from humiliation to vindication? Have you ever had a moment where you were completely underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? Share your own stories in the comments below. We read every single one, and they inspire us to find more tales like this. If this story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next story we have in store for you.